I'm going to read Michael's short biography. He's got a much longer one, and we can send this to everybody if you're interested in reading more about Michael. Michael Collins is Executive Director, Americas of the Institute for Economics and Peace, the IEP. For those of you who don't know, that is Rotary's partner in peace building. The world's leading think tank dedicated to developing matrix to analyze peace and to quantify its economic value. I'm just going to let that digest for a minute because that's a lot in that sentence, and I think it's very important for us to understand how important it is and how important it has been to Rotary as we move towards understanding that peace has to be our focus. It is the IEP and their dedication to quantifying the economic value of this that has helped Rotary to get to where it's at right now. Leveraging private sector and almost 20 years of humanitarian and development experience, he is responsible for expanding IEP's impact, including the adoption of positive peace as an evidence-based tool for effective peace-centered development. And Michael, so that you know, many people in this room have used your tools without even knowing they were the tools that you developed. Many people in this room have been to our District 50 ADP Summit, where we've introduced those tools, and we've introduced to clubs how to utilize those tools to vet any project that they're doing, and then create a component of the project that is peace-focused and peace-centered around the 8 pillars of positive peace. So with that as an introduction, Michael, as I said, when we first saw each other in the room, it is always my great pleasure to connect with you again. And we're just so honored to have you in the room. Thank you so much for being with us.
Excellent. Thank you, Maria. And I agree, we are very much among friends. So I'd love for this to be as kind of sort of informal as you would like. So technically, this is sort of a presentation of the latest key findings from the Global Peace Index, our flagship report. But there's probably kind of sort of like 3 different things that I'd like to throw your way, leveraging the fact that we are very much a group of friends and everyone focused on the same thing. So the slides may not come across as kind of sort of polished as they are usually, simply because I want to present those kind of sort of 3 things. So let me just go ahead and share my screen nonetheless. The first thing that I wanted to mention was this, and just to make the best of the screen here. So this is a map of Mexico, and this is what we'd call subnational data, and every single one of these little chunks that you see is essentially a municipality in Mexico. Now, overlaid on top of that are the Rotary districts within Mexico. So this is just kind of sort of one indicator that happens to sort of align with one of the indicators in the Global Peace Index. But, imagine a scenario in which not only for the peace and conflict prevention pillar of Rotary, but also for the other 6 pillars of Rotary, you were able to have maps that kind of sort of pointed you as a club, or alternatively as a district, or maybe as an intercountry committee, or a kind of sort of district to district initiative to potential areas where your efforts, your expertise could be potentially leveraged. Now, this is a homicide map. It just happens to be the most sort of granular version of a sort of a diverse map that we had. So I wanted to show it to kind of sort of make the point. In all honesty, if you were to try and do this globally, you wouldn't be able to arrive at this level of resolution. But the premise is, from a data-driven perspective, and the kind of work that IEP does, and we try to do, is to provide this level of granularity as to where are the places that need the most help and in what particular areas. So this could equally be a, access to water map, for example, or it could be levels of literacy, or it could be level to access to maternal health care, for example. So part of the premise and kind of sort of one of the broad areas of distinct interest for the partnership, at least from IEP's perspective, is to see how we can increasingly contribute to mapping in its various forms to be able to sort of better help different clubs and districts position themselves. And to say, look, we are very much focused on water. Where are the largest water needs within our particular, state or municipality, or at the very least country? So things like the Global Peace Index, for example, are very much focused on this kind of sort of country level measure of peacefulness. Now, from an operational perspective within Rotary, especially at the level of a Rotary club, that's kind of tough because you can't expect to have an impact on an overall country. But which is why I sort of presented this initial map that is, looking at things in a much more granular way as a potential way forward when it comes to that meaningful sort of, engagement and leadership from a Rotary perspective. Anyway, back to the Global Peace Index, which is the main premise of the meeting today. And then I'll bring about, with your permission, positive peace, which is the fundamental basis for the partnership with Rotary. So here we are. This is sort of a snapshot of levels of peacefulness around the world based on the metrics of the Institute for Economics and Peace. Maria, you kindly introduced IEP. And yes, we focus a lot on measures of peacefulness and econometric measures related to it. And our mission as an organization is to create a paradigm shift in the way that the world goes about understanding and building peacefulness. The first thing that we aim to do was to create a sort of a tight definition of peacefulness, which may be unsatisfactory to some, but it provides us with a baseline, the absence of violence or fear of violence. And it's difficult to be able to sort of find specific measures and statistics related to the absence of violence or fear of violence. And although we're very much focused on peacefulness in an organization, things like homicide rates are a good place to start. So, for example, there are 23 indicators that we use for the Global Peace Index. Measures of conflict, for example, immediately what comes to mind is, well, the Ukraine and Russia, right? Thousands of people are dying. 2,000 people on average are dying every month in that particular conflict. We use those measures as a basis for understanding, yes, where there is conflict, but more importantly, where there isn't conflict, right? And we'll get to that as the basis for positive peace a bit later on. So things like internally, measures of safety and security, so homicide rates, incarceration rates, the number of police on the streets, for example, the impact of terrorism, political instability, violent demonstrations are things that we look at as well to be able to ascertain these baseline measures of peacefulness. And then measures of militarization. So military expenditure. And we see this as symptomatic of a lack of peacefulness or the absence of violence or fear of violence. And let me give you what is hopefully a practical example. So imagine two different countries. And in one country, you have low levels of, in both countries, you have low levels of homicide and low levels of conflict. Great, two peaceful countries, right? Fantastic. But it turns out that in one of these countries, you have very, a massive police force and a massive military, and there's police out on the streets, right? So you would then say, well, actually, the more peaceful country out of one of those is the one that can maintain low levels of conflict and low levels of homicide without the need for very high levels of incarceration, a lot of police on the streets, significant investments in the military. You'd say it's more symptomatic of peacefulness that they are low in all of these measures across the board. So these measures are not meant as kind of sort of a moral reflection or, how many police or how much military investment is actually necessary. There is an optimal level. Of course, police are going to be required even in the most peaceful nations. But the premise of the whole work is the more peaceful countries are the ones that have lower measures across the board. So that's the basis for the index. And using that, we can kind of sort of use that to generate changing measures or to understand changing measures of peacefulness worldwide, including a very specific measure as to whether the world in a whole is becoming more or less peacefulness over time. So it deteriorated last year, and this is an ongoing trend that we'll see later on. It's been deteriorating sort of pretty much year on year for the last 15 years. A lot more countries deteriorated in peacefulness globally than improved last year. Some of the improvements that we saw specifically last year are about violent demonstrations. So we saw a peak of those sort of just during and just after COVID, and those have continued to kind of sort of improve. Terrorism around the world has become a lot more concentrated in fewer countries. Although overall, more people have died. So the Hamas attack in Israel was one of the major drivers of deteriorations in terrorism. But perhaps more unreported, more people died from terrorism in Burkina Faso than they died in Israel over the same year. But nonetheless, it is in a very small amount of countries. So for the most part, globally on average, terrorism has improved, and the homicide rate has improved globally on average as well. One of the big shifts that we're starting to see now is changes in militarization that we're going to delve into a bit. Previously, we had globally been becoming less militarized. And over the last couple of years, we've started to see the shift towards higher measures of militarization. Logically, I would say, in response to this increasing amount of conflict that we've seen around the world. Now, again, it's not a value judgment. It's not to say that we should become more or less militarized, but it is just a study of these dynamics. Importantly, though, a lot of the Global Peace Index this year is focused on this increase in conflict that we're seeing around the world. So a lot of the indicators that have driven this deterioration that you see here are based on conflict measures. There are more conflicts now than any time since World War II. 56 conflicts around the world. Now, that's not 56 separate countries. In some instances, there are multiple different types of conflict within a single country, for example. But it is nonetheless the largest amount that we've seen. And probably one of the most worrisome things is that a lot of these conflicts are what we call minor conflicts today, but we see as having the opportunity to become much larger conflicts. If we look back to both Ukraine and Russia, Gaza and Israel, where's another major conflict now? Sudan, for example, right? Ethiopia. These are all conflicts that back in 2019, we would have classified as these minor conflicts that are now massive conflicts. So that we see that there's significant danger of actually those large, many more larger conflicts than we are seeing today. And this is the first time perhaps that we're being so bullish in reporting this because of what we see as the significant risk. On top of that, or as a consequence of that, parallel to that, we're seeing a lot more countries participating in external conflicts. So the United States or many other countries, European countries, their participation in the Ukraine war between Russia and Ukraine is an example of that. Again, we attach no moral judgments to this, and everyone has their own opinion, but it is symptomatic of part of sort of a broader trend. But a lot more sort of middle-income countries, even developing countries, are becoming a lot more involved in other countries' conflicts as well. Conflict is becoming significantly more messy. And the more actors are involved, the more and more difficult it's becoming to resolve these conflicts. So I'm going to skip ahead a slide here, just to show what I think is a particularly interesting one, this one on the right-hand side. Just very quickly on the left, you can see here, these are monthly active conflicts around the world. And as you can see, that's at a 25-year high, and it's been increasing progressively over the last decade. If it's all right, I'm going to ask you to focus on this right-hand slide. And maybe we'll focus first on this maroon section. And this is what we call one-sided victory in any particular conflict that's happened since essentially the 1950s. We used to be a lot more unipolar. The United States used to be the primary superpower, and a lot of conflicts were resolved, at least as the way that we interpret it, primarily because there was either, number one, an overwhelming military victory, whether that be from the non-state actor, i.e. the revolutionary force that then becomes the government, or alternatively, the government. Or alternatively, there was a peace agreement. So in this case, the blue line that has continued to kind of sort of withstand the time. And oftentimes it was kind of sort of the power of the United States as the singular superpower that enabled the victory of the government, either by direct military support or other means or political pressure, or alternatively, making sure that a peace agreement was signed and, okay, guys, let's stop fighting now, full stop, right? And to be able to leverage that political power that it has. Now, the world, in all honesty, has become a lot less unipolar. It's become sort of multipolar. A lot of conflicts, a lot of countries vying for power, the Chinas, the Russias, but increasingly the Turkeys, the Ethiopias, many more regional powers. So the number of conflicts that have been resolved through a government victory have gone down significantly from like over 50% or nearly 50%, I should say, excuse me, in the 1970s to less than 10% today. Peace agreements, right? The number of conflicts that have been resolved by peace agreements have dropped significantly as well. So 25% of conflicts were resolved by peace agreements. That's down to less than 5% today. Now, the result of all of that is that there's been this significant increase, as you can see by these kind of sort of this mint green color here, in what we call these active conflicts. They may be low activity. In other words, then, there's no massive war now, but the conflict is still there and can basically blow up in any circumstance, as is, for example, the current conflict of the war in Gaza. From a sentiment analysis perspective, we've been seeing the conflicts between Palestinians and Israelis, continue to increase since the last Intifada, and of course now blow up, first with the terrorist attack in Israel, and then retaliatory measures by Israel into Gaza. I'm going to skip over this. It's just a sort of a quick reiteration of this increase in what we call these internationalized interstate conflicts, right? In which there is a war within a country, but there are many different actors beyond the government and the non-state actor that's vying for power. Now there's participation from bordering countries, from international countries, and it's becoming significantly more messy. So coming to sort of these three domains that I presented in the beginning, the green line here is the increase in conflict that we've seen. Essentially, everything is indexed to one back before 2010. So progressively, we've been seeing this increase in conflict worldwide. We've been seeing an increase in, or a deterioration, I should say, in there's these internal security measures around the world for the most part. Less so, it's remained pretty static, in all honesty. We had traditionally, as you can see in here, been seeing improvements in militarization metrics. That means that the world had been becoming less militarized. But we've seen this sort of shift over the last couple of years. A lot more countries are becoming, are investing in the military. All militarization indicators deteriorated last year. Military expenditure increased in, from memory, 36 out of the 44 European countries. I hope I'm getting that right. No, I'm not. 23 out of the 36 European countries have increased military expenditure, and 36 out of the 44 sub-Saharan and North African countries have deteriorated in measures of militarization as well. Now, because of these changing dynamics and some of the other stuff that we've seen, we've actually created a new measure of military capability that starts to look into military capacity rather than military numbers. A lot of the traditional volume and a lot of the traditional metrics used by IEP and other organizations have focused on things like how many troops do countries have? How many boats do they have? But as we're seeing these technological advancements, we're seeing that countries are reducing the amount of troops that they have around the world, even though their overall military capacity is increasing over time. So although overall troop numbers have reduced on that measures, military capacity has increased by over 10% over the last decade. Militaries are investing a lot more in drones, for example. As you can see by these slides here, this is drone usage by group, both for non-state actors and states. As you can see, it's exponentially increased just over the last couple of years. And as a consequence, unfortunately, the number of drone attacks around the world has also exponentially increased, both by state and non-state actors. I realize we're kind of sort of getting quite sort of technical on some of the metrics, so I'm going to take a step back and just focus back out sort of regionally. Regionally speaking, geographically speaking, we've seen deteriorations pretty much in all regions, with the exception of Eurasia, the Eurasia region. North America recorded one of the largest deteriorations, but interestingly, mostly based on internal measures. So we've seen quite a significant increase in perceptions of criminality, both in the United States and in Canada. So I'd be very interested to see what are the reflections of the group on that. Canada continues to do very well in the Global Peace Index, is currently ranked 12th or 12th, I believe. The United States doesn't do so well. It is a highly militarized country. It participates in a number of external conflicts. It has relatively high measures of homicide, one of the highest incarceration rates in the world, relatively high levels of gun violence for the most part. Europe deteriorated in peacefulness, I have to say, including a number of countries that had increases in homicide, but it continues to be the most peaceful region. And El Salvador had and the Emirates had the largest improvements. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, Palestine and Israel saw the largest deteriorations for the obvious reasons. Ecuador in Latin America, for those who may be interested, has seen a significant increase in gang violence, assassination of political candidates, and Haiti, I'm sure, is in all of our hearts as well. Seems to never be able to get out of its conundrum. Most improved, I mean, one of the things that I'd like to highlight perhaps here is sort of a very interesting dynamic, and perhaps why I spent so much time talking about how countries that do well across all of these indicators. Salvador saw the largest improvement in peacefulness last year in the Global Peace Index because it's seen a radical reduction in overall homicide rates and crime. Now, one of the prime reasons for that is because the president in Salvador has done a lot of reforms, including mass incarceration of members from gangs. Essentially, 1% of the El Salvadorian population is now incarcerated. Mostly gang members, mostly young people with tattoos. But for some people, their only crime was being young and having a tattoo. So one of the ongoing challenges for the country there, and one of the reasons that it continues to rank actually still very poorly in the Global Peace Index, so it's ranked 107 despite having that significant improvement, is the many questions that exist around human rights violations. There's an increasing amount of displacement within the country, civil rights issues. So although it's been critical to be able to sort of install a degree of rule of law, there's many questions now as to, okay, well, what's going to happen next? How are we going to improve in the other domains without homicides continuing to increasing? So a lot of credit does go to the current president, both externally and by the Salvadorian population. I've yet to meet a Salvadorian who doesn't massively approve of everything that Nayib Bukele has done is the president in that country, because they are like, I mean, at least the conversations I've had, I can go out on the streets now. The gangs are no longer there. I can go about my business. I can confidently set up my own business. I can visit my family. And for many people, and for good reason, that is absolutely critical. And they're very happy to take the hit for that basic right. So very interesting dynamics there. Here are the most peaceful countries. I realize I'm probably going on quite a bit here, so I'm with your permission, I'll cut it short, but very happy to revisit a lot of this. Even though these are most of the countries, most of these countries deteriorated slightly in peacefulness last year. Singapore, Malaysia, and Switzerland were the only ones to improve in peacefulness. At the lower end of the spectrum, Yemen, the least peaceful country in 2023, overtook Afghanistan last year, Sudan, South Sudan, Ukraine and Russia for the obvious reasons. Israel as well, and then other conflicts that we hear less about, the DRC, Mali, and a number of them that are out of the top 10. We do calculate the economic impact of violence each year. We like to frame it in terms of the economic value of peace. And this is essentially a number that would become readily available for productive purposes, for healthcare, for education, for basic provision of public services, should we be able to find ways of improving peacefulness over time. Now, this is a year. Bear in mind that number is a year. Now, to touch on positive peace, and specifically the positive peace report, the Global Peace Index is kind of interesting because it provides us with that ranking of countries based on their measure of peacefulness. That's all fine and dandy. The question is, what do we do with it, right? That's great. Okay, now we know that this country is the most peaceful and this country is the least peaceful. Now what? Well, we spend a lot of time doing statistical research to try and understand what actually creates and sustains peacefulness over time. Now that we've created that ranking, how can we understand what these peaceful countries have in common so that we can try and replicate that in our own countries and our own communities to the extent that we can? So this is the basis for our positive peace framework. There were out of the 25,000 data sets that we were able to look at. In fact, we've been able to look at a lot more. There are 500 indicators that correlated strongly with these improvements in peacefulness over time. All of those fell within these 8 buckets that then came to be known as the 8 pillars of positive peace, which we use as the basis for our partnership with Rotary. Here are the pillars that you're thankfully very familiar with, and Bill and Maria and the rest of the team. Thank you for all of your leadership in sort of presenting these pillars to other Rotarians around the world. The premise here is that it's empirically based. If you have any faith in the methodology that we use for the Global Peace Index, you can have faith in the fact that statistically, these are the characteristics that we see. And even though it's a very simple framework and very simply worded, there's over sort of 15 years of detailed analytical research that goes into it, and it's empirically based. And interestingly, it kind of describes very complex dynamics in what we hope is a very simple way. But importantly, it provides sort of this actionable framework for building peace over time. So how would we go about this? Well, you're kind of familiar with the workshop methodologies that we use. We have found that positive peace is something that's found near universal acceptance. People get it. And once people are convinced that it is empirically based, they're kind of like, okay, fine, I get the pillars. Let's do it. Let's go for it, right? So there's lots of conversations around how people can apply these figures in these pillars in their daily lives. I'm going to share some examples of that. I'm going to share a personal example. I catch the ferry to New York every day. We can only aim to have an impact from a positive peace perspective within our own capacity and the resources. That it would be no sense in me trying to have an influence on positive peace in the United States. I don't have that ability. But my ferry is large enough to potentially help build positive peace in the ferry. There's like 80 or 90 people that are in this ferry. And I noted in the very beginning of being in this ferry, commuting to New York, that there's always a lot of tension in the ferry. People want to get to work. People are always like queuing up to get on and off the ferry as quickly as they can. And I thought about, in order to improve my own lot, in order to feel better and less stressed, I'm going to try and create positive peace within this particular environment. So I started leveraging these 8 pillars of positive peace to think about how I could help build positive peace. So the first thing that occurred to me, and this is just an example of the random stuff that can occur to us. I'm not saying this is the way it should be done. This is the ways that I leverage the framework personally. I thought about the sound business environment and how that applies in the context of the ferry. And the first thing that I realized is that, a lot of people are on their way to their jobs. A lot of people are very stressed because they need to be somewhere for an appointment. And the first thing that I can do perhaps is to kind of sort of, cut people a break. If they are impatient with me, if they're cutting in front of the line, yes, I could consider that they're terrible, horrible people and they could be considerate, or I could consider that maybe they're just having a bad day and they're just trying to get to their meeting, and me interfering with them is going to affect the sound business environment. Alternatively, they're sitting on their computer and they do not want to be disturbed with me regaling them with stories, contributing to a sound environment in that very, very simple way. The acceptance of the acceptance of the rights of others. Well, maybe I'm going to try and I'm going to make sure that I always offer, when I'm in the line and the 2 lines converge, I'm always going to make sure that person can pass in front of me. The point of all of this is there are very small actions that we can do in each one of these pillars that could potentially help build positive peace over time. Now, I'm not gonna say that I help build positive peace in that ferry. Believe me, there's still lots of work that can and needs to be done. But I was most satisfied and pleased when, for the first time, something that I had actually been doing, such as allowing someone to pass me in the ferry, happened to me. Someone kindly allowed me to kind of sort of pass in the line, and it came full circle. And I'd like to think that that is now continuing to sort of resonate within the ferry and is having a systemic impact. That's not, I'm not not sure, not throwing any form of credit to me, but I wanted to just use this as an example of, number one, our ability to impact systems through positive peace, and two, very different ways in which we can sort of leverage these individual pillars. So when we do sort of context analysis, or when communities leveraging the pillars of positive peace do context analysis, there's a whole lot of questions that you can ask around these pillars. How would we define and measure change for each of these pillars locally? A sound business environment means something completely different in the Colombian context, which is one you can see here in this image, than it may be for Glacier Park, right? What are some of our strongest attributes as a community, as a Rotary Club on a pillar per pillar basis? What would we want to prioritize? Yes, of course, we can aim to have a massive chunk of stuff, do a whole lot of things. Maybe you want to concentrate on a single thing. That is totally fine. Maybe my singular thing is going to be allowing someone to pass me in a ferry rather than concentrating on a whole bunch of stuff. But at the same time, that whole bunch of stuff doesn't need to be, you don't need a whole lot of money, or you don't need a whole lot of time to do it. It can be very small stuff. One of the key added values of something like positive peace, we feel, is that simply by reflecting on the potential impact that you are having through what you do, or alternatively could have, can elicit new ideas and can make sure that you're not having an undue negative impact. I remember very clearly a case of a Rotary Club doing fantastic work in Mexico, and they were importing essentially wood frame houses across the border, perhaps not leveraging some of the local community's capacity and local businesses and things that would help drive an improvement in positive peace, and then an improvement in negative peace, right? Peacefulness, a reduction in homicide, a reduction in crime, because they were perhaps not leveraging all of the community strengths that existed there. So this one I'm going to skip over because I ended up presenting it in the beginning. That's it. I realized it was kind of sort of like a mishmash of everything. I hope I was able to kind of sort of connect it. Very happy to revisit this and to talk about any one of these aspects in a lot more detail, of course.